Hello, friends. Do you think you know history? The kind written in thick books where dates and names march in neat rows? Forget it. Today you'll learn about a quack surgeon who saved 16 lives, flipping through a textbook right in the middle of surgery. About a battle that was won by loading cannons with chunks of old cheese, and about a scientist who ate a mummified heart of a king just out of gastronomic curiosity. Buckle up. We are heading to a place where facts sound like fiction and reality laughs at any screenwriter. In our kind tradition, please like this video and comment on which city you are listening to us from. It really helps the growth of our community. Let's get started. Story number 1. The Great Thorny Wall That History Preferred to Forget. Honestly, if I hadn't seen maps from the 19th century with my own eyes, I would think this is a plot for bad fantasy. Seriously? We all know the Great Wall of China, right? Stone, grandeur, cosmos. Now imagine there was another wall, almost as long, but built not from granite but from bushes, living, fierce, thorny bushes. And it sliced through one of the most densely populated countries in the world in half. Let's transport ourselves to India in the mid-19th century. Heat, dust, spices, and British colonizers who loved money very, very much. Back then, salt was not just a seasoning. In the hot climate, without salt, you're a dead body. It's needed to keep meat from rotting and to prevent people from fainting from dehydration. And the British East India Company figured it out. If you control salt, you control life. They imposed a tax, a wild, extortionate tax on salt that was extracted from the sea. But there was a problem. Deep in the continent, there was plenty of salt, and it was worth next to nothing. Smugglers were transporting it by the tons, bypassing checkpoints. What does a normal government do? Lower taxes? Strengthen the police? No. The British decided, let's just block off all of India. Sounds like a joke, right? But they approached it with frightening seriousness. The project was named the Internal Customs Control Line, a boring name for a crazy scheme. At first, it was just ditches and piles of dry brush, but smugglers leaped over them, laughing in the faces of customs officers. And then someone had a brilliant yet cruel idea. They began to plant a living hedge. These were not neatly trimmed shrubs like those gardeners shape in English estates. Oh no. This was a monstrous mix of Indian plum, acacia, cacti, and bamboo. The plants intertwined, forming an impenetrable green rampart almost 4 meters high and 4 meters wide. The thorns were so sharp they pierced leather soles. And do you know how long this thing was? 2,500 miles. Think about it. 2,500 miles. That's the distance from London to Istanbul, or from Moscow to Krasnoyarsk. And it was a complete wall of thorns, cared for by 12,000 people. 12,000 gardener police officers who watered, trimmed, and patched holes in this green monster. It was the Great Indian Hedge. No person could sneak through it, and not even a tiger could squeeze past. Even snakes got caught in this thicket of thorns. This was perhaps the most grandiose and absurd monument to bureaucracy in the history of humanity. Imagine the scene. Thousands of miles under the scorching sun, and in the middle of the plain stretches an endless, ominous wall of thorns, patrolled by people ready to kill for a bag of salt. The poor were starving because they could not buy salt, and it seemed that nature itself had risen up against humanity, creating this barrier. It stood for nearly 40 years. For 40 years, this prickly noose suffocated the continent, and then it disappeared. By the end of the 19th century, the salt tax was finally made reasonable, and the wall was abandoned. And here is what is astonishing. The nature that had been used as a weapon quickly reclaimed its own. Without care, the bushes dried up, burned, were cut down for firewood, or eaten by termites. Today, almost nothing remains of the great hedge. Not a single brick, not a sign. Only old maps in dusty offices in London and rare mentions in the memoirs of travelers who wrote about the green scar on the face of India. We have forgotten it, as we forget a bad dream, but the earth remembers. And you know what is the strangest part? Sometimes, while walking through the Indian countryside, One can stumble upon a strange strip of unnaturally dense bushes that grows in a perfectly straight line, as if measured with a ruler. The locals don't even know why it is there. This is an echo of the time when greed made people build a wall from the sea to the mountains just to ensure that no one could salt their rice for free. By the way, my friends, for the most curious, I have left links to all the primary sources in the description. Check them out as we continue. Story number 2. The surgeon who learned to cut while cutting. Listen, we are used to thinking that professionalism comes from years of studying, diplomas, sleepless nights over textbooks, and shaking hands during the first exams, right? It makes sense. You wouldn't get on a plane if you learned that the pilot practiced flying on video games last night. You wouldn't lie down under the knife of a surgeon who had only carved a turkey for Christmas before. Or would you? Let's travel back to 1951, the Korean War, the cold gray sea where a Canadian ship floats. On board, Samato smells iodine and fear. A boat arrives carrying wounded South Korean soldiers. There are 16 of them, and they look, to put it mildly, not very good. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel in their chests, ripped open abdomens. They need surgery right now. Or, in an hour, they will be simply thrown overboard in bags. All eyes turn to the ship's doctor. His name is Joseph Cyr. He was a charming and calm man with keen eyes. The crew adored him. He treated their teeth, and he did know how. He reduced dislocations and handed out cough tablets. But this is not a cough. This is a chest cavity torn apart by lead. The captain looks at the doctor with hope. "Save them, Doc." The doctor nods. He orders the operating room to be prepared and rushes to his cabin. Why? To pray. To take a drink for courage? No. He rushes to read because the man whom everyone called Dr. Joseph Cyr was actually Ferdinand Waldemaro. He did not just lack a medical diploma. He barely finished school. He was a brilliant impostor who stole the name of a real doctor, forged documents, and joined the Navy simply to hide from his past. Imagine that moment. You stand in a cabin, people are dying outside the door, and you frantically flip through a textbook on military field surgery, trying to remember where, for heaven's sake, the lung is and how not to cut the aorta. Any normal person would have had a heart attack from fear, but Damara was anything but normal. He possessed a terrifying supernatural memory and a complete absence of fear. He entered the operating room, said to the nurses, "Let's get started," and began cutting. This sounds like a black comedy script, but it's a fact. He opened the chest of a soldier while glancing at the pictures in the book he held open to the side. He removed a bullet that was lodged just a millimeter from the heart. He stitched wounds closed. He injected them with penicillin in doses that would make modern doctors faint, simply because he feared infection more than any side effects. He operated for 48 hours straight without sleep. Do you know how many patients died? 0. Not a single one. All 16 soldiers survived. The imposter, learning surgery in real time as he operated, performed a miracle that not every professor could achieve. The legend of the miracle doctor spread instantly. He was written about in the newspapers. The mother of the real Dr. Joseph Cyr saw the article, recognized the photo, and said, "Wait a minute. That's not my son, Joe." The deception was uncovered. The Canadian Navy was both furious and shocked. How? How did this guy, who had been a monk, a prison guard, and a teacher, also with forged diplomas, manage to perform such complex operations? The ship's captain refused to hand him over for a tribunal. "I will not judge a man who saved so many lives," he said. Damara was quietly dismissed and asked to disappear. By the way, do you think he calmed down? Of course not. Later, he worked as the deputy warden of a prison in Texas and, they say, was an excellent deputy, until he was recognized from a magazine photo again. Ferdinand Damara proved a strange and uncomfortable truth. Sometimes a diploma is just a piece of paper, and audacity is second luck, or even first. But honestly, I would still prefer my surgeon to read textbooks before picking up a scalpel, not during anesthesia. Story number 3. A man who didn't sink, even when he tried very hard. Have you ever felt like a failure? You know, a day that just doesn't go well, spilling coffee, missing the bus? If so, let me introduce you to John Bebacom Ali, a man whose misfortune was so epic that it ultimately saved his life. Although, it depends on how you look at it. Perhaps it was the executioner who wasn't lucky. The end of the 19th century, England, an era of fog, top hats, and justice that didn't like to deliberate for long. John Ali was accused of the brutal murder of a wealthy lady for whom he worked as a footman. The evidence was rather weak, mainly circumstantial. He had a cut on his hand. He was the only man in the house. In general, the jury had enough. The verdict? Death by hanging. John swore he was innocent. God knows I didn't do it, he insisted. But the judge only yawned and banged his gavel. A date was set, February 23rd, 1885. The prison in Exeter. Hanging. The procedure is technical, almost engineering-like. There's a trapdoor in the floor, a rope, a lever. The executioner, James Barry, was a professional. He checked the mechanism the day before, oiled the loops, placed a sandbag on the trapdoor, pulled the lever, and the trapdoor opened, dropping the bag. Everything worked perfectly, like Swiss watches, but for killing. The morning of the execution arrives. John Lee is taken to the courtyard. A priest mutters a prayer. They bind John's hands, put a sack over his head, and throw the noose around his neck. He stands on the trap door. His heart is pounding in his throat. The executioner pulls the lever. And nothing happens. The trap door doesn't open. John stands there. The crowd freezes. The executioner yanks the lever again. And again. The trap door seems welded shut. John fidgets, hearing creaks and murmurs from the executioner. They take him down from the gallows and lead him back to his cell. The executioner, furious, calls for a carpenter. They check the mechanism, set the sandbag back on. The trap door opens. They jump on it themselves. It works. John is brought out a second time. Again, a prayer. Again, the sack over his head. Again, the noose. Again, the lever. And again silence. The trapdoor remains solid, not even a quiver. John Lee stands on it like a monument to himself. At this point, even the prison warden feels uneasy. Whispers of divine intervention circulate through the crowd. But the law is the law. An order to hang him. The mechanism is checked again. The planks are planed, thinking they swelled from dampness. They inspect the loops. Again, the sandbag plummets down with a hiss. The third attempt. John Lee isn't afraid. He's just tired. He's back on the gallows. The executioner, red with shame and anger, leans on the lever with all his weight. Nothing. The trapdoor beneath John Lee has turned into the most reliable platform on earth. At that moment, even the priest's nerves gave out. The prison doctor said, "Enough. We can't execute a man 3 times in one day. This is torture." John was taken back to his cell. The execution was cancelled, replaced with life imprisonment. And here's the most interesting part. Engineers puzzled over this for a long time. There were theories about rain causing the planks to swell only under the weight of a person, but not the bag. There were theories about the loops shifting, about the inmates who built the gallows cleverly sawing it, but they never found the exact answer. The mechanism worked perfectly before John and perfectly after, just not under John. John Lee served 22 years, was released, married, and moved to America, where he died of natural causes in his old age. The man whom the British Empire could not kill. They say that in prison he loved to tell this story to his cellmates and would always add, "Apparently God had plans for me," or "The devil just broke the elevator to hell." Story number 4. A woman who gave birth to rabbits and tricked the kingdom. In the world of medicine, there are many strange chapters, but this one is the absolute champion of absurdity. If there were an Oscar for acting in obstetrics, it would go to Mary Toft. Year 1726, England, the Age of Enlightenment, Newton, science, reason. And amidst all of this, a poor illiterate peasant woman from Surrey declares, "I am giving birth to rabbits." Don't laugh. She didn't just say this to her neighbors over a pint of ale. She called for a doctor. The local surgeon, John Howard, rushed to her home and was bewildered. He genuinely delivered the births and brought forth parts of animals, limbs, heads, pelts, a dead bunny, then another one, and even a cat. Yes, a cat. You heard right. Howard was in shock, but being a man of science, or at least what was considered science at that time, he began writing letters. Colleagues, a sensation. Nature has gone mad. The rumors reached London. Even King George I sent his court anatomist, Nathaniel St. Andre, to investigate this wonder. St. Andre arrived, saw Mary in agony giving birth to yet another rabbit, and believed. Not only did he believe, but he wrote a treatise, a serious scientific work, explaining with a learned demeanor how this was possible, claiming it was the power of maternal imagination. Mary, during her pregnancy, had seen a rabbit in the field, had a strong craving to eat it, got scared, and voila, the result. At that time, doctors seriously discussed the theory of maternal impression, so the ground was fertile for such beliefs. The entire country went mad. People stopped eating rabbit stew, fearing it might be someone's relative. Newspapers screamed with headlines. Mary Toft was brought to London, settled in a luxurious bathhouse, and showcased as a curiosity. The best minds of Britain poked her belly and nodded knowingly. Yes, there was something jumping inside, but the farce couldn't last forever. One skeptic, a doctor named Richard Manningham, sensed something was off. He noticed one small but crucial detail. The stomachs of the born rabbits contained hay and grain. Moreover, the droppings were suspiciously fresh. How could a bunny have eaten hay while being in a woman's womb? Manningham threatened Mary with a painful operation to examine her insides for the sake of science. Mary, not being foolish, feared the scalpel more than the shame and confessed. The scheme was absurdly primitive and horrifying. Mary simply inserted parts of animals inside her beforehand and then simulated contractions. Sometimes her husband helped her, having bathed the rabbits at the market. Why? For fame? No, for money. They hoped the king would grant her a pension as a unique phenomenon. The scandal was monumental. The reputations of the doctors who believed this nonsense were destroyed. St. Andre, who wrote that infamous treatise, became the laughingstock of all London and died in poverty. Cartoonists drew the doctors with bunny ears for years. Mary Toft spent a little time in jail, but she was released. The judges decided she had already been punished by public ridicule. Besides, the absurdity of the scheme made it foolish to try her seriously. This story is an eternal reminder to us all. Even the smartest people, professors and royal surgeons, can believe complete nonsense if it is shocking enough and if they really want to believe in a miracle, even if that miracle is fluffy and has ears. Story number 5. The Man Who Sold Big Ben. Forget about Victor Lustig and his Eiffel Tower. That story is too well known. But have you heard about Arthur Ferguson, a failed Scottish actor who turned his life into the most expensive performance of the 20th century? The 1920s in London, Trafalgar Square. Ferguson is strolling, pondering where to find money for lunch. Then he sees an American tourist, wealthy and naive, dressed in an expensive suit, admiring Nelson's column. And a light bulb goes off in Arthur's mind. He approaches the American, introduces himself as a government agent, and with a sad, trustworthy expression, shares secret information. Sir, Britain is bankrupt due to war. We have huge debts. The government is forced to quietly sell off national monuments to avoid panic among the people. The American's mouth drops open. And you know, Ferguson continues, lowering his voice, we are looking for a worthy buyer for this column, someone who will appreciate its history. Within an hour, the deal was closed. Ferguson received a check for £6,000, a huge sum for those days for Nelson's column. It worked, and Arthur was on a roll. He didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, he sold Big Ben to another tourist for £1,000 deposit. To another couple from Arkansas, he sold Buckingham Palace for just £2,000. The deposit, of course, convincing them that the royal family was moving to more modest accommodations. He was a genius of psychology. He played on two things, the desire of wealthy tourists to take a piece of old England home, and their absolute belief that money can buy everything. When things got hot in London, Ferguson headed off to the US. The logic was simple. If Americans are so easily buying England, what would they buy back home? And he was right. In Washington, he leased out the White House for a long term to a wealthy rancher, assuring him that the government was cutting expenses and moving to an office building. He was nearly able to sell the Statue of Liberty to an Australian, but the buyer proved a bit more suspicious and asked to take a photo with the seller in front of the monument. That photo marked the end of the great conman Ferguson's career. He was caught. He served 5 years in prison. But the funniest part of this story isn't just the audacity of the conman. It's that the victims were too embarrassed to report him to the police for months. Can you imagine walking into a police station and saying, "Excuse me, I bought Big Ben and they won't give me the keys"? Ferguson died in poverty in 1938, but his legacy lives on. Every time you see a tourist who believes in an exclusive offer just for you, somewhere in heaven, a shrewd Scotsman smiles slyly at having almost sold time itself. Story number 6. An army that attacked on bicycles and stole a country. When we think of World War II in the Pacific, we envision aircraft carriers, jungles, marines, and fierce battles for every piece of land. But there was one operation that resembled a scene from an absurdist comedy, if only it weren't so brilliant and fatal. 1941, Malaysia, a British fortress, Gibraltar of the East. Singapore seemed impregnable. The British were convinced that the jungles in the north were impassable for tanks and large armies. They anticipated an attack from the sea, pointing all their guns toward the ocean. Japanese General Tamayuki Yamashita knew this, and he faced a problem. He had 3 times fewer soldiers than the British. His fuel for the tanks was running out. He had no chance in a head-on assault. So, he made a decision that would enter the tactical textbooks under the labels of madness and bravery. He placed his army on bicycles. Yes, regular, inexpensive bicycles. Thousands of Japanese soldiers pedaled along narrow paths in the jungles where tanks would have gotten stuck and trucks couldn't pass. But that was not the strangest part. The Japanese knew that the tires would burst in the heat, and they were short on rubber. What to do? They simply rode on bare metal rims. Imagine that sound. Thousands of bicycles clattering metal against asphalt and stones. The noise was unimaginable. And that's where psychology came into play. The British defenders, sitting in their trenches, heard this rising, clattering din that sounded like the rumble of tank treads. "Tanks!" they shouted in panic. They had hundreds of tanks. They had broken through the jungles. The British were demoralized. They thought an armored armada was heading their way, but in reality, it was sweaty, weary infantry on bicycles without tires. Yamashita pushed on to the very end. By the time he reached Singapore, he nearly ran out of ammunition. If the British had launched a counterattack, they could have crushed the Japanese in a couple of hours. But British General Percival, frightened by the speed and the tank-like noise of the enemy, decided that resistance was useless, and he surrendered. 130,000 British, Indian, and Australian soldiers laid down their arms before 30,000 Japanese on bicycles. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British history, the Bicycle Blitzkrieg. It sounds funny until you realize the scale of the tragedy. Sometimes, it is not the one with the most guns who wins, but the one who figured out to strip the rubber from the wheels to scare the enemy with noise. Story number 7. The man who literally ate the king's heart. We often use metaphors. He absorbed knowledge. She swallowed resentment. But William Buckland, the eccentric British geologist and paleontologist of the 19th century, took the verb to eat a bit too literally, frighteningly literally. Buckland was not just the scientist who first described a dinosaur. By the way, he was the one who coined the term megalosaurus. He was obsessed with the idea of tasting everything, absolutely everything living on the planet Earth. His home in Oxford resembled a zoo, crossed with the kitchen of a mad chef. Guests invited to dinner never knew what would end up on their plates. "What is this, Buckland?" a guest would ask, poking at a strange, tough piece of meat with a fork. "That's a panther," the host would reply, unfazed. Not as tender, don't you think? Last time the crocodile was more tender. His menu included mice, which he loved in batter, ostriches, kangaroos, guinea pigs, and even shrews. He kept a taster's diary where he precisely described the flavors. He called the worst dish of his life a mole. A disgusting, earthy taste, he wrote down. We are willing to believe it with erudition, but the pinnacle of his gastronomic madness was the incident at the aristocratic estate of Lord Harcourt. In 1848, Buckland was invited to view a family relic. Lord Harcourt proudly brought out a large silver box. Here, the Lord whispered with reverence, lies the mummified heart of King of France Louis XIV, the very King of the Sun. The heart was small, shriveled, and black as a coal, a great relic saved from revolutionaries. Buckland took it in his hands, turned it, smelled it, and before anyone could blink, he said, "I have eaten many strange things, but I have never tasted a king's heart," and he popped it into his mouth. The silence in the room must have been deafening. Lord Harcourt paled. The guests froze, and the great scholar William Buckland simply chewed and swallowed a piece of the monarch who had ruled France for 72 years. Crunchy, he summarized. Thus ended the story of Louis XIV's heart. Not in the fire of revolution, not in the dust of ages, but in the stomach of a British scholar who simply could not resist a new culinary experience. Buckland passed away several years later, but the legend of him lives on. And, to be honest, it's a great lesson. Never show your relics to people who eat moles for breakfast. Story number 8. The prison from which everyone escaped. A prison break is always a drama. Tunneling, sawed bars, a descent on sheets under the cover of night, barking dogs, beams of searchlights. Hollywood has trained us to believe that freedom comes at an incredible effort. But the story of the prison in the city of Peterborough, Ontario, proves the opposite. Sometimes freedom requires just a gentle nudge of the shoulder. The year is 1888, autumn. The Peterborough prison is a solid stone building, the pride of the local sheriff. The walls are thick, the bars are strong. Inside sit various people, from petty thieves to rowdy drunks. And then one morning, the guard arrives at work, pours himself some coffee, goes for his rounds, and drops his mug. The cells are empty, every single one of them. The corridors are deserted, the yard is empty. The prison stands utterly abandoned, like a haunted house. Everyone has vanished, the inmates, the suspects, even those who had just a few days left to serve. Panic, alarm, a chase. No, first there was confusion. How did they do it? Mass hypnosis? Teleportation? The solution turned out to be hilariously simple and shameful. The night before, the warden's wife threw a small party. Music, pies, dancing. The guards, it seems, decided that guarding empty corridors was boring and joined in on the fun. And when the party ended, the last departing employee simply forgot to lock the main door. Not the door leading to the cells, but the main, massive outer door of the prison. But that was only half the trouble. The cell doors were also unlocked. Why? Because in the 19th century, in small towns, the regime was, let's say, familial. Inmates were sometimes allowed to step into the corridor to stretch their legs or fetch some water. And just imagine, it's night. Silence. One of the detainees pushes the cell door. It's open. He steps into the corridor. No one. He walks toward the exit. He pushes against the main door. It creaks as it yields. Fresh night air, stars, freedom. He returns for the others. "Hey guys, they forgot to lock us in, and they left. They just took their things and calmly walked out, without a fuss, like checking out of a hotel." The funniest part happened afterward. Some of the escapees didn't even need to be caught. They came back themselves a couple of days later. "Forgive me, sir," one of them said, knocking back on the same door. "I just went home to check on my wife and eat some decent food. Can I finish out my sentence?" Others, of course, disappeared forever. The sheriff became a laughingstock across Canada. The newspapers wrote, "In Peterborough, prison operates on an all-inclusive basis, including exits. From that point on, there must have been a number one item added to the prison instructions, printed in bold. When leaving, check that the door is locked, even if you really want to sleep. Story number 9. The ship that sank while saving coal. In maritime affairs, there is a concept of the captain's honor. The captain is the last to leave the vessel. The captain is responsible for lives. The captain is a rock. But in 1909, the captain of the steamboat and the crew of another ship rewrote the code of honor, adding a chapter titled Absurd Greed. Imagine one night in thick fog off the coast of Nantucket. The luxurious liner Republic of the White Star Line, yes, the same one that would build the Titanic 3 years later, collided with the Italian liner Florida. The impact was terrible. The Republic suffered a breach in the engine room and began to sink slowly. But this is not a story of tragedy. This is the story of the first coordinated rescue operation in the world, conducted by radio. Marconi had just invented the wireless telegraph, and the captain of the Republic, Jack Binks, became a hero, tapping out the distress signal SOS, predecessor of SS. The liner Baltic came to help. It rescued passengers from both damaged ships. The casualties were surprisingly few. Only 6 people died in the collision. Rescued, happy ending, or so it would seem. The Republic did not want to sink quickly. It stubbornly remained afloat. Then Captain Silby decided the ship could be saved, and so could the cargo. And the cargo was, to put it mildly, interesting. Rumor had it that there was gold on board worth a huge sum, the payroll for the American fleet. But officially, there was coal and supplies. Captain Silby stayed aboard the sinking vessel with a small crew of volunteers. They waited for tugs. But the strangest behavior was that of the crew of the Florida, which also remained afloat, albeit with a battered bow. When the passengers had been transferred to the Baltic, the captain of the Florida suddenly remembered the coal. The Republic was sinking, the Florida could barely stay afloat. Yet the sailors began transferring coal from one ship to the other. Imagine this surreal scene. In the fog, in the middle of the ocean, 2 battered giants were locked together. One was slowly going under, while people, instead of praying or saving themselves, were hauling bags of coal. Why should good things go to waste, they probably thought. At the bottom, it's useless to anyone, and we have a long way to go to port. Greed or resourcefulness triumphed over the instinct of self-preservation. They were unloading coal for several hours until the Republic began to tilt dangerously. In the end, the Republic ultimately sank. Captain Silby and his crew jumped into the water at the very last moment and were rescued. The gold, if it was there, sank to the bottom, where it remains to this day, driving treasure hunters mad. And the coal, part of the coal for which they risked their lives on a sinking ship, safely arrived in New York in the hold of the Florida. Apparently, for sailors of the early 20th century, fuel was more important than the fear of death. The irony of fate. The Republic became the largest ship to sink in history at that time, but it entered history not as a tragedy but as the first triumph of radio and a monument to human pettiness in the face of the abyss. Story number 10. A criminal who made a career in show business. Imagine a film set, sunny California, an amusement park in Long Beach, 1976. Television crews are shooting an episode of the popular series The $6 Million Man. A lighting technician moves an old dusty mannequin of a hanged man in the corner, painted in some toxic shade of orange. The prop looks shabby. A crew member yanks its arm a little too hard, and the arm comes off. The worker curses, bends down to pick up the limb, and freezes in horror because a real human bone is protruding from the plastic arm. The police are called to the set, followed by the coroners. They open the dummy and confirm the impossible. This is not a mannequin, it is a mummy. An actual desiccated human body that had hung in the funhouse for years, scaring children. And no one, not even the park owners, knew it was a corpse. Who was it? His name was Elmer McCurdy, and his life was pitiful. However, his posthumous biography is a true Hollywood blockbuster. In the early 20th century, Elmer was perhaps the most unsuccessful bandit in the Wild West. He attempted to rob trains, but mixed up the dates and attacked the wrong car, obtaining, instead of a safe filled with thousands of dollars, only $46 and 2 bottles of whiskey. He tried to blow open safes with nitroglycerin, but overdid the dosage and melted the silver coins into a single shapeless lump that could not be pried off the wall. In 1911, he was finally shot dead by sheriffs during a gunfight. And that's when the real story began. At the undertakers in Oklahoma to which the body was brought, there were no relatives to pay for the funeral, but the undertaker was a resourceful man. He embalmed Elmer with a generous dose of arsenic, dressed him in a suit, put a rifle in his hands, and displayed him in the window of his funeral home. A sign read, "The Bandit Who Didn't Surrender." It cost 5 cents to see him. People paid. Elmer became a local attraction. The undertaker was making a killing, until one day 2 brothers of the deceased arrived, tearfully demanding to have the body returned for a proper burial. The undertaker complied. Only these were not brothers. They were owners of a traveling circus. From that moment began the crazy odyssey of the dead Elmer. He toured America for 60 years. He was exhibited in penny arcades, wax museums, and cheap sideshows. He was referred to as either an ancient criminal or a man who had turned to stone. Over the years, his skin darkened, his ears shriveled, and his clothing changed countless times. Ownership changed hands, and the story that he was a real person faded away. He became merely old props. He was tossed in warehouses, covered in lacquer, and hung in a noose to scare visitors at a haunted house. Thousands of people passed by, laughed, and pointed, unaware they were looking into the face of a corpse that had died long before the First World War. It wasn't until 76, when his hand was accidentally torn off, that Elmer found peace. His identity was confirmed through old police photographs and a bullet lodged in his chest. He was buried in Oklahoma at the Boot Hill Cemetery, but this time, to prevent Elmer from going on another tour, 2 cubic meters of concrete were poured over his coffin. It seems he is the only case in history where a person earned far more money and fame after death than during his lifetime. The irony of fate. The unsuccessful robbers still made it to television, albeit as a prop with a severed hand. This is the story number 11, a man who was tried for murdering himself. We are used to seeing a defendant in court, a victim, and these are 2 different people. However, in 1812, a legal anomaly occurred in the English town of Hammersmith that would make modern lawyers' eyes twitch. Meet Thomas Millwood, an ordinary stonemason, a good guy who loved his wife, his job, and white clothing. That was his fatal mistake, the clothing. At that time, hysteria reigned in Hammersmith. At night, a ghost was seen in the cemetery. People swore that a tall white figure would leap out from behind gravestones, moaning and frightening passers-by half to death. One pregnant woman even died from shock after encountering the spirit. The area was in a panic. Men formed patrols with guns to capture the ghost. Among the hunters was one Francis Smith, young and hot-headed, armed with a pistol. On the evening of January 3rd, Thomas Millwood was returning home from work. He was dressed in his work uniform, white trousers, a white flannel jacket, and a white apron, all covered in lime dust. In the darkness and fog, he glowed like, well, yes, like a ghost. Francis Smith saw a white figure in the alley. "Halt! Who goes there?" he shouted. Millwood, tired after his shift, said nothing or simply didn't have time to respond. Trembling with fear and adrenaline, Smith fired. Millwood fell. The ghost turned out to be a dead stonemason. In court, everything seemed clear. Smith killed a man, but the defense presented an argument that puzzled the judges. Smith didn't intend to kill Millwood. He shot at a ghost, and you can't kill a ghost because it is already dead. Therefore, Smith had no intent to murder a person. It sounds logical, quite so for the 19th century. But then, the mother-in-law of the deceased took the stand. She testified under oath that just days before the tragedy, she begged her son-in-law to change his clothes. "Thomas," she told him, "everyone thinks you are a ghost. Wear a coat." Thomas merely waved her off, and at this point, the court found itself at an impasse. It appeared that Millwood knew his white clothing was dangerous, knew there was panic in town, yet still went out into the darkness dressed like the main local scare. Lawyers began to seriously discuss whether this could be considered a form of suicide, or at the very least, criminal negligence on the part of the victim. It turned out that Mill provoked his own death with his appearance. Smith was initially sentenced to hang. The judge was strict. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, you cannot shoot people in the street. However, public outrage ensued. People felt sorry for the ghost hunter. The king intervened and replaced the sentence with a year in prison. And the Mason Thomas Millwood entered legal history as the man whose fault was that he loved White far too much and didn't like listening to his mother-in-law. By the way, the real ghost, the prankster in a sheet who scared people for laughs, was found a few days later. It turned out to be a shoemaker who simply wanted to take revenge on his apprentices. Story number 12. The corpse that won the election. Politics is a dirty business, they say. But in mid-20th century America, in the state of Missouri, it became an otherworldly affair as well. In 2000, yes, the story is relatively recent, but in the archives of curiosities, it has already become a classic. The elections for the Senate were underway. The main candidate for the Democrats was Mel Carnahan, an experienced politician, a governor, and a public favorite. His opponent was the Republican John Ashcroft. The race was neck and neck. Debates, rallies, posters. But 3 weeks before Election Day, tragedy struck. A small plane carrying Mel Carnahan crashed in the woods. Everyone on board died, the candidate himself, his son the pilot, and an aide. The state was in shock. Mourning, candles, tears. But there was a bureaucratic snag. The ballots had already been printed, millions of ballots. Missouri's laws are strict. Changing candidate lists in such a short time is not allowed. Striking a name from the ballot is also prohibited. Mel Carnahan's name remains on the list. The situation is absurd. People will go to the polls and see the name of a man who has already been buried. What to do? Republicans publicly expressed their outrage, but in their headquarters, they were rubbing their hands together.
But who, for heaven's sake, would vote for a dead man?
Ashcroft's victory seemed inevitable. He even paused his campaign out of respect for the deceased. But the Democrats made a brilliant move. The widow of the deceased, Jean Carnahan, addressed the people and said, "If you choose my husband, I will take his place in the Senate and be his voice." And then strange psychology kicked in. On one hand, there was sympathy. On the other, the principle. It doesn't matter who, as long as it's not a Republican. And thirdly, Americans simply liked the idea of voting for a ghost. Election Day, November 7th. People went to the polls, and Mel Carnahan won. The dead man, lying in his grave, defeated the alive, healthy, and very ambitious John Ashcroft by more than 40,000 votes. This was the first time in U.S. Senate history that an election was won by a deceased candidate. John Ashcroft entered the history books as the man who lost a debate to a corpse. It is said that he accepted defeat with dignity, saying something like, "I hope voters know what they're doing." Legally, the victory was formalized this way. Since the winner could not, for obvious reasons, take the oath of office, the governor of the state appointed his widow to the vacant seat. Jean Carnahan served in the Senate for 2 years, proving that behind every great man stands a woman, even if the man is already in the afterlife. Story number 13. The man who bought his own freedom, 3 times. Slavery is one of the darkest chapters in history. Usually, we hear about slaves who escaped, rebelled, or perished. But the story of Moses Grandy is about a man who chose to play by the system's rules to defeat it from within. And the system tricked him time and time again, but he was more stubborn. The early 19th century, the American South. Moses Grandy was born a slave. But he was not just any slave. He was a talented captain of a riverboat. His owners valued his skills because he made them good money by managing barges. Moses had a dream, to buy his freedom. In those times, this was theoretically possible. A slave could work overtime, save money, and if the owner agreed, pay for his emancipation. Moses worked like there was no tomorrow. He transported cargo, engaged in small trades, and saved every cent for years. Finally, he amassed the necessary sum. He approached his owner and laid the coins on the table. The owner smiled, took the money, and sold Moses to another owner. Imagine the despair. All those years of labor, all that hope. It was stolen in an instant. Anyone else would have broken down, turned to drink, or jumped off a bridge. But Moses Grandy was made of different stuff. He gritted his teeth and started from scratch. With the new owner, he negotiated another buyout, worked nights again, and saved up. Several more years went by. The amount was collected, and he handed over the money. And what do you think happened? You guessed it. The owner took the money and resold him to a third owner. It sounds like some sadistic joke, like the curse of Sisyphus. A man bought his freedom twice and ended up a thing twice. But the third owner, Mr. Stewart, had a conscience? No, not really. Moses simply became smarter. He realized that a white gentleman's word in the South meant nothing when it came to a slave. For the third time, he saved money with maniacal determination. But this time, he didn't just hand it over to the owner. He found a white man he could trust. Yes, they did exist. And he asked him to serve as a mediator. When he gathered the amount for the third time, think about that, 3 full prices of a man, the deal was made. In 1833, Moses Grandy received that coveted paper. He became free. But that wasn't the end. Do you think he ran north and lived peacefully? No. He still had a wife and children. They were still slaves. And Moses went back to work on the river, now as a free man, earning a full salary. He worked for many more years, buying his family one by one, his wife, his children, his grandchildren. He spent his entire life and a fortune doing this. Moses Grandy died a free old man, having written memoirs that read like a thriller. A man who proved that freedom is not a gift, but a commodity. And if you've been cheated at the register, you don't walk away, you get back in line again. Story number 14. The skyscraper that sat down while washing. They say the devil is in the details. And in Texas in 1919, it turned out that the devil was hiding in the punctuation marks. Let's travel to the city of Wichita Falls. Imagine the atmosphere. An oil boom. Black gold is gushing from the ground in fountains. The city is flooded with people who were farmers yesterday and today have become millionaires. Everyone is in a hurry. Everyone wants to grab their slice of the pie. There aren't enough offices. Deals are being made right on the street in the dust, on the hoods of cars. And then he appears. J.D. McMahon, an engineer, entrepreneur, a man with honest eyes and a thick folder of blueprints. He gathers wealthy investors and says, "Gentlemen, our city needs a symbol, a skyscraper, a grand building that will be seen from a mile away." He unfurls the drawings. The investors see a beautiful structure reaching upwards. They see the number 480. 480, the oilmen whisper in awe. That's the height in feet. We will outshine Dallas. The money was raised instantly. $200,000, an outrageous amount for those times. McMahon hired a crew, and the construction began to bustle. Investors walked by, proudly glancing at the fence. But then, questions began to arise. The building was growing, yet somehow it was strange. It was narrow, too narrow. And it wasn't rising up but seemed to be stuck in development. When the workers laid the last brick, the skyscraper turned out to be only 12 meters tall, 4 stories. It was a red brick turret that could hardly fit a desk inside. The stairs were so steep that one had to climb them like they were Everest. The investors were furious. "Where's our skyscraper?" they shouted, dragging McMahon to court. "You promised us 480 feet." The judge took the blueprints, looked at them carefully, then glanced at the red-faced investors and delivered a verdict that probably made the courtroom burst into laughter or despair. "Gentlemen," the judge said, "Mr. McMahon built exactly what was drawn. Look closely." In the blueprints next to the number 480, there was not one line indicating feet, but 2 lines. Inches. 480 inches is exactly 12 meters. The investors, blinded by greed and haste, simply failed to check the scale. They signed a contract for the construction of a 4-story extension, thinking they were buying the Empire State Building. McMahon was acquitted. He honestly fulfilled the contract. However, he didn't dare to stay in the city and fled before the disappointed investors could lynch him. And the building? It still stands today. It is called the smallest skyscraper in the world. Locals wanted to demolish it for a long time, but then came to love it as a monument to human inattentiveness and greed. In the end, it might just be the only building in the world constructed not from bricks and concrete, but from a single small typographical error in the client's mind. Story number 15. The war that an entire fleet slept through. The story is filled with great naval battles: Trafalgar, Jutland, Midway, cannon fire, smoke, heroism. But there's one battle that military historians talk about in whispers, avoiding eye contact out of shame and suppressing nervous laughter. The year? The Spanish-American War. The American cruiser Charleston receives a secret order to capture the island of Guam. It was a Spanish colony, an important strategic point in the Pacific. Captain Henry Glass mentally prepares the crew for a serious fight. The Spaniards will defend themselves until the end, he thinks. On June 20th, Charleston approaches the island. In the bay, an old Spanish ship is anchored. On the shore, Fort Santa Cruz is visible. Captain Glass commands, "Fire!" American cannons let off a salvo. Boom! Boom! Shells whistle over the water but miss their mark. The captain ordered to shoot over the fort to demonstrate power and offer surrender. The smoke dissipates. Silence. There is not a single shot from the Spanish side. No panic, no soldiers running about. The fort remains silent. The ship in the bay gently rocks on the waves. They're setting a trap, Captain Glass darkly thinks. Or are their cannons so long range that they're allowing us to get closer? The Americans wait. Nerves are on edge. An hour passes and then a small boat departs from the shore. A few Spanish officers in parade uniform sit in it. They row towards the American cruiser. Diplomats, decide the Americans. The Spaniards board the Charleston. They smile, they bow. The leader among them, Captain Porta, speaks in broken English. "Good day, gentlemen. Welcome to Guam." The American captain looks at them as if they're fools. "Are you surrendering?" he asks. The Spaniard blinks in surprise. "Excuse me, we wanted to thank you for the salute. It's very kind of you to greet us with shots. Unfortunately, we have no gunpowder in the fort to return the salute." A pause. A long, awkward pause during which the sound of brains creaking can be heard on both sides. It turned out that the Spanish garrison in Guam simply did not know that a war was happening. They had no telegraph. The last mail arrived 2 months ago. They lived in blissful ignorance, thinking that the United States and Spain were best friends. When the Americans began firing live rounds, the Spaniards thought it was friendly visits and military honors. Captain Glass, stifling either laughter or pity, shared the news with them. "Gentlemen, you are my prisoners. We've been at war for half a year." The faces of the Spaniards fell. The governor of the island was furious, not at the enemies, but at his postal service. The next day, the entire garrison, 54 men, surrendered without a single shot fired. This was the only battle in history that ended with apologies for the defeated not having powder to return the salute. Guam became American. And history proved that sometimes ignorance is not strength, but the best way to lose a war without even starting it. Story number 16. The lawyer who proved innocence, dying for it. In court, it is often said, "I am ready to give my life to prove my client's innocence." A beautiful phrase, dramatic. Usually, after it, the lawyer simply adjusts his tie and takes a seat. But Clement Vallandigham, a famous American politician and lawyer of the 19th century, was a man of his word. Too much, quite literally. The year is 1871. The state is Ohio. A sensational murder case. A man named Tom Myers was shot in a bar. The prosecution claims that he was killed by Thomas McGann, the client of our hero. All the evidence is against him. A quarrel, a motive, witnesses. It seemed like a conviction was guaranteed. But Vallandigham builds a defense on a bold theory. "My client did not shoot," he states. "Myers shot himself. Accidentally." The judge raises an eyebrow skeptically. How can someone accidentally shoot themselves in a bar during a fight? Vallandigham explains. Myers was pulling his gun out of his pocket, the trigger caught on his clothing, and bam, an unfortunate accident. It sounds unconvincing, the jurors yawn. Volandi GM realizes that visual evidence is needed. He needs an experiment. The evening before the final session, he rehearses his speech in his hotel room. He invites fellow lawyers. He wants to show them exactly how it happened. Volandi GM takes the gun. He believes it to be unloaded. This is the key moment. Look, he says, pacing the room. This is how Myers reached into his pocket. This is how he pulled out the gun. He slides the barrel into his trousers pocket, pulls it up, mimicking the snag of the trigger. The barrel is aimed at his stomach. A click. The shot booms in the small room like a cannon blast. The gun turned out to be loaded. The bullet pierced the lawyer's stomach. Volandi GM fell to the carpet, bleeding. His colleagues rushed to him in horror. "My God, Clement!" they screamed. The doctors arrived quickly, but the wound was fatal. Volandi GM suffered throughout the night. But here lies the irony that makes one uneasy. His death became the perfect, irrefutable proof of his theory. The next day, court resumed. The news of the lawyer's demise shocked everyone, but the argument was ironclad. If an experienced lawyer who knows firearms could accidentally shoot himself while demonstrating this trick, then a drunken guy in a bar could do the same. The jury acquitted Thomas McGeehan. He was released from the courtroom. Clement Volandi GM won his last case. The price of victory was his own life. He became perhaps the only lawyer in history who defended a client not with eloquence, but with his own death. By the way, gossip later whispered, "I wonder if he took his fee in advance." Story number 17. The man who invented civilization. Imagine a dinner in Europe during the Middle Ages. A castle, torches flickering, a mountain of meat on the table. Lords and ladies in heavy clothes, smelling of sweat and smoke, grabbing greasy pieces with their hands, gnawing on bones and throwing them under the table, where dogs scavenge. They drink wine from rough metal goblets. All dishes are dumped on the table at once. Fish next to game, pies mixed with porridge. This was the norm. This was the culture. Now let's move south to Córdoba, in the shining caliphate of Al-Andalus. Here, escaping from envy, rushed in from Baghdad a man by the name of Abul Hassan Ali ibn Nafi. Too complicated. Let's simplify. His name was Ziryab, the blackbird. Ziryab was a musician, a poet, a genius, but honestly his main talent lay elsewhere. He knew how to live beautifully, and he was horrified at how Europeans lived. When he arrived in Córdoba, he didn't write complaints in a suggestion book. He simply began to change the world around him, quietly but inexorably. Think that's an exaggeration? Well, look, before Ziryab, people didn't know what a three-course meal was. They just ate everything haphazardly. Ziryab said, "Hold on, this is barbarism. First soup, then the main course, either meat or fish, and only after that dessert, fruits, and nuts. A revolution." Before Ziryab, wine was consumed from golden and silver goblets. Ziryab grimaced. Metal spoils the taste of wine, and besides, it's quite rude. He envisioned crystal glasses for the court, light, transparent, and ringing. Shock. Before Ziryab, people dined on tablecloths that were washed only once a year. Ziryab brought from Persia the idea of leather napkins for the table that could be wiped clean, but he didn't stop there with food. Why do you wear the same thing in winter and summer, he wondered, and introduced the fashion for seasonal clothing. Light, bright silks for summer, dense, dark fabrics and furs for winter. He even established specific dates for when the court should change outfits. He opened the first hair salon in Europe and introduced the trend for short haircuts and bangs. Yes, that very bang style that became known as bank. Before him, aristocrats roamed around unkempt and bearded. And finally, the most important thing, for which we all owe him a monument. Ziryab brought with him the recipe for the world's first toothpaste. He mixed some herbs and minerals to create a formula that not only cleaned teeth, but also smelled pleasant. Before him, charcoal, or, urine, was considered the best oral hygiene method in Europe. This man, a runaway from Baghdad, single-handedly taught medieval Europe how to eat in order, drink from glass, get haircuts, change clothes with the seasons, and clean their teeth. He even taught them to eat asparagus, which had been seen as a weed before him. We do not know what Zeryab looked like. Not a single portrait of him remains. But every time you sit at a table, pick up a fork, drink from a glass, or squeeze toothpaste onto a brush, somewhere in the depths of the ages, a black bird smiles at you. A man who proved that history is not just about warriors and kings. Sometimes it's simply about delicious food and fresh breath. History number 18. The city that was drowned in wine. Imagine a flood. Murky torrents of water, mud, panic, rescue boats. A horrific picture, right? Now replace the water with red wine. 1,000 liters of first-class Portuguese wine. Year. Lisbon, the Baixa district. It was not just a city. It was the center of global trade. Ships brought gold from Brazil and spices from India. But Portugal's greatest treasure was wine, port wine. It was stored in vast cellars, in gigantic oak barrels. On one hot summer day, something went wrong in the cellars of an old winery. Whether a barrel cracked from the heat or a worker stumbled and knocked over a tap, no one knows for sure. But one barrel began to leak. A chain reaction. A cascade of wine flowed, undermining the supports of neighboring barrels. One after another, like dominoes, the giant containers started to fall and break. The cellar turned into a bubbling lake, but the wine did not stop. It burst through doors and flooded into the streets. This was not a flood. It was a wine deluge. Rivers of red wine flowed down the narrow cobbled streets. First thin streams, then rushing torrents up to the ankles, then to the knees. The air filled with a thick, intoxicating aroma. The residents' reactions were mixed. Of course, merchants whose shops were submerged in sticky red sludge were horrified. The products were ruined, losses incurred. But the rest of the city saw this as a gift from heaven. People rushed out of their homes with buckets, pots, jugs, hats, anything they could find. They scooped up free wine right from the pavement. Some simply lay on the ground and drank from puddles. Drunken sailors sang songs while standing waist-deep in the port. It is said that even priests brought out communion chalices from the church to collect a bit of divine grace. By evening, the entire Baihu district was dead drunk. This was probably the most joyful apocalypse in history. No one died, except for the wine producers' reputations. No one was seriously harmed, except for those suffering from hangovers the next morning. The city authorities, of course, were less than thrilled. They had to spend several days cleaning the sticky streets of wine and getting the population back on their feet. But the story became part of the city's folklore. To this day, in Lisbon, jokes are told that in the year 76, even the horses drank not water but sangria from the fountains. The moral? Sometimes a disaster is just an excuse for a good party, especially if the disaster smells like grapes and oak barrels. Story number 19. The man who set Europe ablaze simply by crossing out a couple of words. Have you ever seen how one word changes everything? How an awkward phrase on a date can ruin the evening. How a typo in a contract can cost millions. Now imagine that a few crossed-out words cost hundreds of thousands of lives and reshape the map of an entire continent. The year is 1870, Berlin. It was an ordinary dinner on a hot July evening. In the room sat three of the most powerful men in Prussia, the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and his generals Moltke and von Roon. The mood could not have been worse. Bismarck was in a funk. His grand plan to unite the fragmented German states into one empire was falling apart. France, led by Napoleon II, was categorically opposed. "It's all over," Bismarck said gloomily, pushing his plate away. "I resign." The generals nodded. They too were ready to resign. The dream of a great Germany was dying right there at the table, under the scent of cigars and fine wine. And then, when dessert was served and conversation had completely deflated, a servant entered the room with a silver tray on which lay a single piece of paper. A telegram from the resort town of Ems. It was sent by King of Prussia Wilhelm I. The telegram dryly reported on his meeting with the French ambassador. The ambassador demanded that Prussia renounce its claims to the Spanish throne forever. The king politely but firmly refused. The conversation was over. Everything was peaceful, diplomatic, boring. Bismarck read the telegram aloud. The generals slumped even further. "Is that all?" Moltke groaned. The king showed weakness. "We are humiliated." And at that moment, something flickered in Bismarck's eyes. He picked up a pencil. "Wait a minute," he said. The king had allowed the content of this message not to be published. He placed the telegram on the table. Do you think he lied? Added an insult? No, he did something far more brilliant and devilish. He began to cross out. He crossed out all the polite phrases, all the words about cordial conversation, all mentions that the issue was resolved. He left only the bare, prickly essence. The original text sounded something like this. His Majesty the King kindly informed the ambassador that he could not make such promises, and with that, the audience came to an end. The edited version read by Bismarck was, His Majesty the King refused to meet with the French ambassador and ordered that it be communicated to him that he had nothing further to say. Do you feel the difference? The first version is a polite refusal. The second is a slap in the face. It's like a door slamming shut right in front of all of France. Bismarck read the new version aloud. The grim generals transformed, and their eyes lit up. "My God!" exclaimed Moltke. Previously, it sounded like a signal to retreat. Now, it was like a red rag to a Gallic bull. The telegram was immediately sent to all the newspapers in Europe. The effect was like a bomb explosion. In Paris, crowds flooded the streets shouting, "To Berlin!" France felt mortally insulted. In Berlin, crowds also took to the streets, but their shouts were, "To Paris!" Germany felt insulted just as much. Within 6 days, France declared war on Prussia, the very war that Bismarck so desperately needed. A war in which France was defeated, while the fragmented German states, uniting against a common enemy, came together to form a powerful German empire. Just a few omitted words, drops of lies, only pure, concentrated truth, presented at the right angle. History has proven that sometimes the most terrifying weapon is not a cannon or a bayonet. It is a red pencil in the hands of a person who knows where to strike. Story number 20. The day Australia disappeared. Imagine a morning. You pour yourself some coffee, pick up the newspaper, and on the front page, in huge letters, it reads, Australia is missing. And this is not a joke or an April Fool's prank. This was a real headline that shocked the residents of a small Swedish town. 1997. The town of Vänersborg, Sweden, a dull, quiet place where the most interesting event is the market on Thursdays. The town has its own newspaper, just as boring as the town itself. It prints announcements, obituaries, and weather forecasts. The editor was a man named Conrad Persson. One fine day, Persson received a telegram from his correspondent in Stockholm. The message was short. The Swedish Academy of Sciences reports that due to severe underground tremors in the Pacific Ocean, the continent of Australia has submerged underwater. Millions of people are dead. Any normal editor's alarm bells would have rung. Check. Call other agencies. This was the news of the century. But Conrad Persson was not like that. He was a man of action and perhaps not the smartest person on the planet. He stopped the press. He completely redesigned the front page. He put a giant screaming headline about the demise of an entire continent. The newspaper was published and flew out of the town like hotcakes. Vänersborg plunged into chaos. People wept in the streets. Emergency prayers were held in churches for the souls of the deceased Australians. A wealthy merchant who had a business partner in Sydney fainted right in his store. Women in black shawls hurried from house to house, spreading horrifying news. The city mourned. The grief lasted for several hours. Then, newspapers arrived in town from Stockholm. There was not a single word about Australia in them. They wrote about the harvest, about the king's visit, about some petty theft. Someone called the capital. "Excuse me, what about Australia?" they asked from Vannersburg. "Australia?" The person on the other end was surprised. "What about it? It's just sitting there. Kangaroos are hopping." It turned out that it had all been a prank. A correspondent from Stockholm had merely bet his friends that he could print anything in the newspaper, even the most absurd nonsense. And he did. When the truth came out, the sorrow in Vannersburg turned to rage. An enraged mob with pitchforks and torches, well, maybe not pitchforks, but definitely enraged, headed towards the editorial office. They wanted to lynch Conrad Persson for drowning their emotions in an imaginary ocean. The editor had to flee the city under the cover of night. He never returned. This story became a legend. It proves two things. First, never trust news that sounds too incredible. Second, if you live in a small, boring town, be careful. Sometimes, one newspaper hoax can trigger a tsunami stronger than any earthquake. Story number 21. The man who poisoned the world with the best intentions. There are people who enter history as villains. Hitler, Genghis Khan, Nero. Their names send shivers down your spine. But there are villains far worse than these. Those who meant no evil. Those who genuinely believed they were saving humanity. Meet Thomas Midgley Jr. If there were a contest for the person who caused the most harm to planet Earth all by himself, Midgley would win by a landslide. And yet, he died believing he was a hero. In the early 20th century, America fell in love with automobiles. But they faced a problem. The engines were knocking. An irritating metallic rattle that reduced power and drained drivers of strength. It was called knocking. General Motors hired a young, brilliant chemist, Thomas Midgley, to solve this problem. And he did. In 1921, after hundreds of experiments, he found a magical substance. Just a few drops mixed into gasoline made the engine run smoothly, quietly, and powerfully. It was tetraethyl lead. In simpler terms, lead. The world was thrilled. Midgley became a national hero. Leaded gasoline took over the planet. And then, hell broke loose. Workers in the factories producing the additive began to go mad. They had hallucinations, jumped out of windows, they died in agony. Newspapers reported on the factory of the insane. What did Midgley do? He called a press conference. Before the astonished journalists, he took a flask containing tetraethyl lead, poured it on his hands, and dramatically inhaled its fumes for a minute. "I could do this every day," he said. "I'm not at risk." He was lying. After this demonstration, he spent a year recovering from lead poisoning, but the world believed him. For the next 50 years, billions of cars emitted microscopic particles of lead into the air. He settled into the soil, the water, and our lungs. Scientists later proved that lead poisoning irreversibly decreases IQ in children, causes aggression, and leads to health problems in entire generations. Midgley single-handedly made humanity a little dumber and meaner. Think that's all? Oh no, that's just the first part. After solving one problem, Midgley tackled another: refrigerators. Back then, they used toxic gases, ammonia, sulfur dioxide. If such a refrigerator leaked, an entire family could die in their sleep. Midgley locked himself in the lab again and found the perfect solution: a new, completely safe, non-toxic gas called Freon. He became a hero once more. Refrigerators and air conditioners became safe and accessible. The world thanked him. Decades passed before we realized what Freon was doing in the stratosphere. It destroys the ozone layer, our only shield against the harsh ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Midgley, unknowingly, created a giant hole in the planet's protection. And here comes the irony, darkening the heart. In old age, Thomas Midgley contracted polio and found himself confined to bed. But he was an inventor to the core. He devised a complex system of ropes and pulleys to lift himself from bed without assistance. In 1944, he was found dead, tangled in the ropes of his own invention, having suffocated himself. The man who created the two most destructive substances for the environment in history was killed by his last harmless creation. Sometimes the road to hell is not just paved with good intentions. At times, it is lined with lead and smells like Freon. Story number 22. The day when all of London came to visit. Have you ever wondered what chaos really is? No, not war, not revolution, but true, pure, senseless chaos, born out of boredom and one silly joke. The year is 1810. London, Berners Street, number 54. A respectable neighborhood. Silence, coziness, order. Here lives the widow Mrs. Tottenham. Her life is as calm as the street outside her window. The main event of the day is the visit from the milkman. Across the street sit two gentlemen, Theodore Hook and Samuel Beasley, both known in the city for their wit and humor. They look at Mrs. Tottenham's house. "I bet you a guinea," says Hook, lazily stirring his coffee, "that I can make this house the most famous address in all of London within 24 hours. Beasley smirks. "Impossible." "Let's see," replies Hook. He takes up his pen and paper. The next morning, on November 27th, someone knocked on Mrs. Tottenham's door. At the threshold stood a chimney sweep. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I did not order a chimney sweep," politely says the widow. Before she can close the door, a cart with coal arrives, then a furniture van, followed by 12 pianos, one after another. Mrs. Tottenham is in a panic. She didn't order anything. And then the madness begins. People start flocking to her house. Not just any people, the entire service industry of London. Dozens of doctors because they were told someone was dying here. Dozens of lawyers because they were informed that wills were being drawn up here. The confectioners with giant wedding cakes, the priests for the funeral rites, and the undertakers with empty coffins. The street is jammed, carriages cannot move, fights begin between the coachmen. But that's not all. Official figures arrive at house number 54. The Mayor of London, the Governor of the Bank of England, the Chairman of the East India Company, even the Archbishop of Canterbury. Each of them has received an urgent letter regarding a matter of national importance. Bernard Street is paralyzed. The entire center of London is caught in a giant traffic jam. The crowd of onlookers grows. Everyone wants to see the house that is trying to accommodate all the most important people in the kingdom at once. The police try to restore order, but can do nothing. This is not a riot, it's simply a queue. A very strange queue. And Theodore Hook spends the whole day in that very cafe, renting a room on the second floor, laughing as he watches the chaos he has created. He wrote hundreds, if not thousands of letters in the name of Mrs. Tottenham. He ordered everything that could possibly be ordered in London to one address at one time. By the evening, when chaos reached its peak, Hook quietly slipped out of the cafe and disappeared. He never had to pay the genius. He won the bet. Mrs. Tottenham became an involuntary celebrity, while London merchants remained suspicious of orders from Bernard Street for a long time. This was perhaps the first flash mob in history, the first viral attack. Proof that to turn a whole city upside down, you don't need an army or a conspiracy, just one bored genius with a pen and ink. Story number 23. The island that declared war on the United States. When we think of America's enemies, powerful empires, terrorist networks, and ideological opponents spring to mind. But in 1982, this list unexpectedly included a tiny island in Florida called Key West. Picture this: sun, beaches, cocktails, and a relaxed atmosphere. The locals call themselves conchs after the shell. Their motto, one human race, tourism is their bread. But one bright morning, paradise was over. The American government, in the fight against drug trafficking and illegal immigration, set up a checkpoint right on the only road connecting the island to the mainland. Every car leaving Key West was stopped, searched, and had its documents checked. For tourists, it was an inconvenience. For locals, a disaster. A traffic jam formed that stretched for 27 kilometers. Tourists, having waited for several hours, turned around and left. The island's economy began to collapse. The mayor of Key West, Dennis Wardlow, flew to Washington. He begged, pleaded, demanded. "You treat us as if we were a foreign country," he shouted at the officials. Nobody listened to him. Then, returning home, the mayor called a city council meeting and said a phrase that left everyone in shock. "Since they treat us like a foreign country, Let's become one. On April 23, 1982, to the applause of thousands of residents, Mayor Wardlow stepped into the square, unfurled a blue and yellow flag with a conch, and solemnly declared Key West's departure from the United States. The Republic of Kong was born. "We declare war on the United States of America," proclaimed the mayor, who became the prime minister. War began. It lasted about 1 minute. Prime Minister Wardlow symbolically broke a loaf of stale Cuban bread over the head of a man dressed as an American Navy officer. In reality, it was his disguised friend. This was the first and last shot in this war. Immediately after that, he announced the surrender. "We give up," he said, "and we demand foreign aid of $1 billion for the restoration of our war-torn economy." It was a brilliant move. The story of a tiny nation declaring war on the United States spread across all global media. Crowds of journalists flooded into Yes, followed by tourists. Everyone wanted to visit the rebellious republic. The U.S. government, seeing this circus and realizing how foolish they looked, quietly removed the checkpoint. The Republic of Kong had won. Formally, it still exists. Every year on April 23rd, the island celebrates Independence Day. They issue their own souvenir passports, they have their own flag, anthem, and even their own army made up of people who throw stale bread. They lost the war in 1 minute, but they won the battle for attention, for tourists, and for the right not to be stuck in traffic. And they proved that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to bring it to absurdity. Story number 24. The city that drowned in manure. London, the late 19th century. Imagine not the elegant carriages from Sherlock Holmes movies, but the smell. A pervasive, thick, pungent odor. The smell of horse manure. In the year, there were more than 50,000 horses in London pulling omnibuses, cabs, and wagons. Each horse produced about 10 kilograms of manure a day. Multiply that by 500 tons every day on the streets of one city. It was not just a smell, it was an ecological catastrophe. In the summer, manure dried and turned to dust that clogged the lungs. In the winter, it mixed with rain and snow, turning the streets into a vile swamp where galoshes and children's shoes sank. And there were flies, clouds of flies, which spread typhus and cholera. The city authorities were in despair. They hired thousands of crossing boys, whose sole job was to clear a path for pedestrians in this sea of excrement. The situation seemed hopeless. In 1994, the newspaper The Times published a grim forecast. Scientists calculated that if the population and the number of horses continued to grow at the same rate, by 1950, London streets would be buried under a 3-meter layer of manure. This was called the Great Manure Crisis. In 1998, in New York, where the problem was just as significant, the world's first International Congress on Urban Planning took place. Delegates from various countries gathered to solve the major problem of the century: what to do with the manure. They convened for 10 days, discussing, debating, and drawing graphs. And you know what conclusion they reached? None. The problem was deemed unsolvable. The Congress ended prematurely because no one could suggest anything other than building taller houses. It seemed civilization was doomed to drown in the waste of its main mode of transportation. The end of the world was supposed to smell like stables. And then a miracle happened, a miracle that none of those smart people at the Congress could foresee. His name was Henry Ford. A car appeared. At first, it was an expensive toy for the wealthy, but then Ford put it on an assembly line, and within a mere 10 to 15 years, horses disappeared from the streets. They were replaced by rattling, smoking, but much cleaner machines. The problem that the best minds on the planet could not solve resolved itself. It was solved by technological progress, of which none of them had thought. The Great Horse Crisis ended without ever beginning. It was simply run over. And this might be the best lesson for all the alarmists and doomsday predictors. Sometimes, when it seems like the world is headed for disaster, somewhere in a garage, an engine is already being assembled that will change everything, and perhaps rid us of the smell we thought was eternal. Story number 25. The artist who painted cats to escape madness. Have you ever seen cat drawings that make you feel uneasy? Neither evil nor scary, just strange? As if the artist peered beyond the veil of reality and painted what he saw there. Meet Louis Wain. In the late 19th century, he was the most famous artist in England. At least, the most famous artist who painted cats. His cats were charming. They played cricket, drank tea, and went to the opera. Fluffy, sweet, anthropomorphic creatures. Wain was a superstar. His postcards sold by the millions. Almost every English home had a calendar featuring his cats. He was kind, eccentric, but altogether a normal man. Then, his wife died of cancer, and Louis's world began to crack at the seams. His behavior became increasingly strange. He could stand for hours in the middle of the street, waving his arms and mumbling something. He claimed that electricity was stealing thoughts from his head. Ultimately, in 1924, he was declared insane and placed in a psychiatric hospital. But he did not stop painting. He continued to draw cats. And here's where it gets interesting. His cats began to change. They lost their cute, cartoonish form. At first, they simply became more vibrant, with eyes filled with anxiety. Then their fur started transforming into complex fractal patterns, swirls, mandalas, kaleidoscopes. The cats seemed to dissolve into the ornament. Their outlines disappeared, becoming pure, pulsing energy. They were no longer cats. They were images from another dimension, bright, psychedelic, almost electric. They resembled what people see under the influence of strong hallucinogens. But Wain did not take drugs. He was simply losing his mind. The psychiatrist who treated him kept these drawings, and today, this series, Kaleidoscopic Cats, is a classic. It is a unique visual chronicle of the disintegration of consciousness. We can literally see how schizophrenia consumed his mind, transforming reality into a complex, frightening, yet mesmerizing pattern. The most astonishing thing is that his technique and sense of light did not decline. On the contrary, they became even more virtuoso. Illness did not rob him of his talent, it merely changed his perspective. Louis Wain, in 1939, passed away without a cure. Until the very end of his days, he painted his strange, vibrating cats, who viewed the world through the eyes of madness. And you know what? Half a century before the rise of psychedelic culture in the 60s, before the hippies and LSD, this quiet English artist in a mental asylum had already painted everything they tried to see. He simply looked at the world a little differently. Story number 26. The Battle That Cheese Won. War is steel, gunpowder, and blood. But sometimes, very rarely, war is about dairy products. 1846, Uruguay, Civil War. On one side were the government forces called Blancos, and on the other were the rebels known as Colorados, supported by the Argentine Navy under the command of Admiral William Brown. Brown was a legend, an Irishman in service to Argentina, a terror of the seas. He blockaded the capital Montevideo from the sea. On land, the city was besieged by the rebels. The situation for the defenders was desperate. Meanwhile, down the Uruguay River was another legendary man, Giuseppe Garibaldi, future founding father of a united Italy. At that time, he was just a mercenary fighting for the Uruguayan government. Garibaldi commanded a small flotilla of 3 ships. His mission was to break the blockade. The 2 fleets met near the town of Costa Brava. Admiral Brown had 7 large, well-armed ships. Garibaldi had 3 small schooners and a handful of Italian volunteers. The odds were entirely against him. The battle began, and it quickly went off Garibaldi's plan. The Argentine cannons were wrecking his ships. One of his vessels ran aground. Ammunition and gunpowder began to run low. Defeat was imminent. Garibaldi realized he would soon be captured and gave the order to explode the ships. Let them not go to anyone else. But there was no powder left for a big explosion. Then one of his soldiers, a former traitor, shouted, "Comandante, we have cheese!" This sounds like the ramblings of a madman, but in the holds of Garibaldi's ships, besides weaponry, he was carrying supplies, including hundreds of heads of old, hard, sun-dried cheese. So sturdy you could use it to drive in nails. The Italians began loading the cannons with cheese. Imagine the face of Admiral Brown when cheeseheads started crashing into his ships instead of deadly cannonballs. At first, the Argentines might have laughed, but then their laughter faded. These stone-like cheese balls, fired from cannons at close range, pierced the hulls and knocked down masts just as well as iron cannonballs. Plus, they had a very strong smell. But the main trick lay in another strategy. Garibaldi ordered to ignite the remaining gunpowder and resin to create a smoke screen. While the Argentines coughed from the smoke and dodged the flying cheese, the Italians abandoned their weapons, jumped into the water, and swam to shore, disappearing into the woods. Brown captured 3 empty burning ships that smelled of gunpowder and Parmesan. Garibaldi saved all of his men. He lost the battle, but won the war for survival. He humiliated the great admiral by bombarding his fleet with food. Later, when Garibaldi had already become a national hero of Italy, he was said to love telling this story and would add, "Never fight with an Italian who has run out of bullets but still has cheese. It's dangerous." Story number 27. The man who accidentally invented chips. We tend to think that great inventions are the result of long labor, insights, and sleepless nights in the lab. But sometimes, a brilliant idea is born not from inspiration, but from pure, concentrated irritation. 1853. The resort town of Saratoga Springs, New York, at the Moon's Lake Lodge restaurant. The chef there was George Crumb, a man of strong character, half Native American and half African American. He was known for 2 things, his talent and his temper. He could not stand it when someone criticized his food. That evening, a particularly picky customer was dining at the restaurant. According to one version, it was the railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt himself. He ordered the house specialty, French fries. Crumb prepared it perfectly, as always. The waiter brought the plate. A minute later, he returned to the kitchen. "Chef, the customer is unhappy," he said. "He says the potato is cut too thick." Crumb frowned but made a new batch, slicing the potatoes thinner. The waiter returned again. "Chef, he's complaining again," he said. "He says it's still too thick." And that's when Crumb exploded. "Oh, he thinks it's too thick," he growled. "I'll make it so thin that he won't even be able to pick it up with a fork." This was revenge, a refined culinary revenge. He took the sharpest knife and started to shave the potatoes into nearly transparent, paper-thin slices. He tossed them into boiling oil and fried them until crispy. Then he took them out and, with a hint of mockery, sprinkled them with salt and sent the waiter back into the dining room. "There, take that, let him choke on it," he tossed over his shoulder. Crumb braced for scandal. He expected the wealthy man to burst into the kitchen yelling, but instead the waiter returned with a beaming face. "Chef, he loves it. He ordered another serving." That troublesome customer, unbeknownst to him, became the first potato chips taster in the world. What was intended as a culinary insult turned out to be a genius discovery. Other patrons, seeing what the magnate was eating, wanted to try this crispy thing too. Crumb reluctantly prepared more and more. By the end of the evening, Saratoga chips, as they were named, had become the main hit of the restaurant. George Crumb never patented his invention, considering it frivolous, but he entered history as the man who proved that sometimes, to create something great, you just need to get very, very angry. So, the next time you open a bag of chips, remember, you are not just eating potatoes, you are eating revenge. Very tasty revenge. Story number 28. The Man Who Heard Trees Growing. Science is about instruments, formulas, graphs, objectivity, and detachment. But sometimes, the greatest discoveries are made not by machines, but by people who can literally listen. The early 20th century, India. In Calcutta lived and worked an amazing man, Jagadish Chandra Bose, a physicist, biologist, archaeologist, writer, a one-man band. At that time, the scientific world was convinced that plants were merely mechanisms, automatons. They grow, reach for the light, drink water, but they have neither feelings nor a nervous system. They do not live in the same way that we do. The boss thought this was nonsense. "If I pinch you, you will scream," he told his colleagues. "If I pinch a plant, it will scream too. We just don't hear it." They laughed at him. Indian tales, British professors whispered. But the boss was not just a poet, he was a brilliant engineer. If the world cannot hear plants, he decided, then they need a microphone. And he made one. He invented a device he called a cryoscope. It was an incredibly sensitive lever system that could amplify the slightest movements by 10 million times. If the tip of a plant moved by 1/1,000,000th of an inch, the pointer on the device would shift by several feet. And he began his experiments. He attached sensors to leaves, stems, and roots, and the world gasped. On the giant screen where the cryoscope's needle was projected, people witnessed for the first time in history the pulse of plants. They saw how a plant shuddered when a match was struck nearby, how it grew tired by evening and fell asleep, how it rejoiced at a sip of water. But the most shocking was the sound experiment. The boss connected his device to a speaker. He took a carrot and slowly lowered it into boiling water. A piercing, high-pitched sound, resembling a cry of pain, came from the speaker. The audience froze. People heard with their own ears how a vegetable died. He went further. He proved that plants respond to music, that they can get intoxicated by certain amounts of alcohol and be poisoned by toxins, dying in convulsions recorded by his device. He demonstrated that plants have their own very slow but quite real nervous system. His presentations at the Royal Society in London created a stir. Newspapers wrote, "Indian scientist made mute plants speak about their suffering." Jagdish Chandra Bose was 50 years ahead of his time. He proved what has now been confirmed by complex equipment. Plants are complex, sensitive organisms. He not only invented a device, he gave a voice to those who had been silent for millions of years, making us wonder if the gulf between us and the humble ficus on the windowsill is as vast as we thought. Perhaps it too listens to us as we talk. Story number 29. An island that fought against itself. When we hear about war, we envision armies, nations, ideologies. But the story of the island of Grunard, off the coast of Scotland, proves that sometimes the most terrifying war is the war against oneself. 1942. The Second World War is in full swing. The British government is searching for new ways to destroy the enemy. They need a powerful weapon. A terrible weapon. A group of scientists in protective suits arrives on Grunard Island. They bring with them unusual bombs. These bombs contain anthrax. They detonate the bombs over the island. The sheep brought in for the experiment die a painful death within a few days. The experiment was a success. The British demonstrated that anthrax is the perfect biological weapon. It kills quickly, efficiently, and leaves the ground contaminated for many years. But the war is over. The project was shut down. Grunard Island was abandoned. And then the nightmare began. Anthrax spores live in the soil for decades. They kill all living things. On Grunard, grass did not grow, birds did not fly, and there were no insects. It was a dead zone, erased from life. The government of the United Kingdom declared, "The island is closed forever. Entry is prohibited under the threat of death." They placed a sign on the shore with a skull and crossbones. And that is when they appeared, a group of Scottish nationalists. They called themselves Operation Dark Reaper. Their goal was to force the government to clean up the island. In 1986, they secretly landed on Grunard and collected hundreds of soil samples contaminated with anthrax. What did they do next? They sent these samples by mail. By mail. They mailed a deadly cargo in envelopes across the United Kingdom to the Ministry of Defense, to the Prime Minister's residence on Downing Street 10. Imagine the panic when letters were opened in London and deadly dust spilled out. Fortunately, no one died. But the government of the United Kingdom realized the jokes were over. If the spores reached the ventilation system, if they were aerosolized in the subway, it would be a catastrophe. Only then did the authorities decide to take desperate action. They spent millions of pounds. They imported thousands of tons of formaldehyde to the island. They drenched the soil with this poison for years. In 1990, after nearly 50 years of quarantine, Grunard Island was declared clean. The grass turned green again, and birds returned. But the most terrifying part of this story is not the bacteria or the bombs, but that it took a small group of enthusiasts risking the lives of millions to understand the scale of the tragedy by spreading contamination through the mail. Sometimes the most frightening enemy is not an external force. It is our own foolishness multiplied by good intentions. Story number 30. The ship that was too proud to sail. Well, here we are at the finish line. 30 stories, 30 scars on the body of time. Stories that are not typically spoken aloud. And for the finale, I have saved something special. Not a story about a hero or a villain, but a story about pride. About such colossal, heavy pride that it sank itself. August 10th, 1628. Stockholm. The air hums with anticipation. The port smells of freshly cut pine, gunpowder, and celebration. Crowds of people filled the waterfront. The King of Sweden, Gustav II Adolf, the Lion of the North, stands in a place of honor. Today, he launches his dream into the water, his weapon, his pride. The ship, Vasa. This was not just a ship. It was a floating palace of death. The largest, most powerful, most ornately decorated warship the world had ever seen. Hundreds of gilded and painted sculptures, lions, mermaids, Roman emperors, 2 full artillery decks, 64 heavy bronze cannons cast with the latest technology. Vasa was meant to be the terror of the Baltic Sea, a symbol of Swedish power. And now it is cast off. Slowly, majestically, amidst the cheers of the crowd and the cannon salutes, it glides into the harbor. The crew sets the sails, just 4 out of 10, merely to catch the gentle breeze. The ship sails 100 meters. The first gust of wind rises. It's neither a storm nor a squall, just a typical summer breeze, creating ripples on the water. Vasa tilts slightly to the left. Nothing serious, it levels out. 200 more meters pass. The second gust of wind, a bit stronger than the first, picks up. And Vasa, the pride of the nation, a marvel of engineering, begins to slowly, almost lazily, tilt to the side. Like a tired hippopotamus deciding to lie down for a rest. The crowd on the shore falls silent. The lower gun ports, forgotten in haste, go underwater. Tons of water rush in. Before the eyes of the king, ambassadors, admirals, and thousands of townspeople, the most powerful ship in the world, without firing a single shot at an enemy, without even sailing 1.5 kilometers on the calm waters of its home harbor, simply lays down on the bottom. It sank in perfect weather, 20 minutes after its first and last departure. Around 30 lives were lost. But the greatest casualty was the reputation of an entire empire. Why? Why did it sink? Because the king was too greedy for glory, and no one dared to contradict him. Initially, the ship was planned to be built with 1 gun deck, but Gustav Adolf, hearing that the Danes had a new powerful ship, ordered, "I want 2 decks and more cannons." The builders and engineers could see that the ship was becoming too tall, narrow, and top-heavy, making it unstable. But arguing with the Lion of the North was equivalent to suicide. They simply constructed what they were commanded. Vasa was too proud to sail. The laws of physics proved stronger than the laws of the king. For 333 years, it lay forgotten and disgraced on the bottom of Stockholm Harbor, until it was raised in the 20th century, and today it stands as the only surviving sailing ship from the 15th century. It resides in a museum as an eternal reminder that even the greatest dream, burdened by pride, is destined to sink. That's it. My archives are closed for today, but remember, the world is filled with such stories. They hide in old newspapers, in footnotes of textbooks, in family legends. You just have to know how to listen to them. Because the most incredible stories are not the ones we invent, but the ones we've simply forgotten.